Welcome to the Chinese-Canadian Museum's podcast, The School Room. I'm your host, Melissa Lee, CEO of the museum. Thank you for joining us. Today, we are so thrilled to have the Honorable Dr. Lillian Eva Quan Dyck join us on The School Room. Lillian is of mixed Chinese-Canadian descent and a member of the Cree-Gordon First Nation in Saskatchewan. She is the first female Indigenous senator, as well as the first Chinese-Canadian-born senator. Lillian was the first Indigenous woman in Canada to get a PhD, becoming a neuropsychiatrist, and later an assistant dean at the University of Saskatchewan. Lillian is the recipient of numerous awards, including a Lifetime Achievement Award by Inspire and the Order of Canada, for advocating for the rights of women, Chinese Canadians, and Indigenous peoples. So today we're going to talk about how Lillian's life also inspired a play, Café Daughter by Kenneth T. Williams, and recently the play was adapted into a film by Shelley Niro. Welcome, Lillian, to our show. Thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
So I know in the bio that I spoke about, there were a lot of firsts that you really pioneered a path for women, for Indigenous people, for Chinese Canadians in Canada. So that's the kind of biohistory, but could you tell us a little bit more about your life in your own words, just reflecting on all these firsts?
That's a tough question, right? I'm almost 79 years old. I didn't set out to be the first female Indigenous senator or the first Canadian-born Chinese senator. It's just the circumstances of the time that I was born. I was very fortunate that I was born into a family where I inherited, strengths from both my parents, and both my brother Winston and myself did really well in school, even though we moved around a lot. And even though we faced a lot of racism, and even though sometimes we were put in the slow room, still somehow that we just kept going. And we were very lucky that we moved to a small city in Saskatchewan called Swift Current. And actually that high school was actually very good. Although in the film, my high school years are depicted as having really bad teachers. Actually, the worst teachers were the professors. It was after I left high school that all those barriers of sex and racism just hit me really, really hard. I kept thinking of my parents and the struggles they had, and somehow we just kept going.
Did you find that the racism and the sexism that you encountered propelled you to work harder, or just really kind of show them that they were wrong in their thinking? Because I think that is one way of becoming stronger, but often it defeats people as well.
Right. I'm very stubborn. And, like as you said, somebody tells me I can't do something, I'm more likely to want to do it. And, as you said, to prove people wrong, that what they thought about me and what wasn't right, that, that I had a lot of talent, that I was, able to do all those things, that I was smart. And actually, I think it was grade 10, where I won the Academic Proficiency Award. And it shocked me. And I was sitting next to my friend and I said, "Did they call my name?" And she said, "Yes." And I'm thinking, that can't be right because I'm not in the smart room. And then after that, that's when I realized I was a lot smarter and had a lot more to offer than the feedback I was receiving. And then from then on, it just seemed like I had the energy and the perseverance and the motivation to keep on going and to use my brain, as it were.
It's so important to have that sense of self-awareness, that even when people are telling you one thing, that you are able to think that they could be wrong. Can you tell us a little bit more about Café Daughter and how you became involved and how the playwright approached you for the story?
Right. It was probably probably close to 20 years ago. I was approached by Kenneth T. Williams. I had been nominated for and received a national, and I think now it's called Inspire. I received an award for science and technology. And as we were talking, he was asking about my family, and I told him that there had been a law on the books in Saskatchewan that prohibited Chinese Canadians from hiring white women.
Right.
And he was quite shocked. He never heard about that before. And so he became very interested in that, and also in the story of First Nations marrying Chinese and this discrimination on both sides of the family. So he and Keith Locke, a filmmaker from Ontario, interviewed me and my brother and some of my relatives out on the Gordon First Nation. And out of that, he, many years later, produced the play Café Daughter.
Did you know many people growing up in your community that were mixed Indigenous Chinese?
No, it's not common. It's not very common on the prairies. It's common in BC, of course, where the Chinese settled when they first came. I suspect there's a lot more intermarriage between BC First Nations and Chinese just because of the numbers. And out on the prairies, typically, they're in a small town. There's one Chinese family who runs the Chinese cafe in town, right? And because of that law that prohibited Chinese men from hiring white women, it allowed Chinese men to hire Indigenous women because they're not white. And so that gave an opportunity for, Indigenous women on the prairies to find employment. So in a way, it kind of promoted, the mixing. And then once you start meeting each other, and of course it's natural that out of that there should be some relationships and marriages happen.
Growing up, did you find that you had a mix of Chinese and Indigenous customs? Do you feel that even now in your 70s, you have a mix of both cultures in the way that, I don't know, the foods that you eat or the books that you read, or how do you think about it or identify?
Well, growing up, our mother told us never to tell anybody we were Indian. That side of ours was kept secret. Having gone to residential school, she was taught to be ashamed of herself, when that everything about her was no good or inferior, that she shouldn't speak her own language, she shouldn't speak Cree. So she instilled in us this message that don't tell anybody you're Indian because they'll be really mean to you. It'll make life more difficult. So we never told anybody. And of course, our last name, Quan, because we would have taken my dad's name. And so we were considered to be the Chinese family that ran the Chinese cafe in town, even though we were mixed. And then people didn't know that my mother was Indian. I don't know whether they thought she was Chinese. Her maiden name was McNabb. And there is Scottish in the background from way back in the late 1700s. So on her marriage certificate, she actually put down, they asked for ethnic identity back then. So she put down Scottish. We kind of were exposed to the Chinese culture, but because we're living in a small town, we're the only Chinese family. And then my dad left China when he was only 12 or 13 years old. So he himself doesn't know that much about the Chinese culture because he left at such an early age. But what kept the Chinese culture alive for him was getting together with other Chinese men through the Chinese Benevolent Society. Chinese New Year's, we would celebrate together. People from other small towns would come and we'd have a banquet. And so that's what kept it going. And then later on, when we were in Swift Current and probably in North Battleford, the Chinese Benevolent Society would have a building or a place where the Chinese men would congregate, and they would, read the Chinese newspapers, speak their language, drink the horrible Chinese liquors and, play mahjong, that kind of thing.
Do you know if your dad, when he immigrated over here, had to pay the head tax?
Yeah, I think he did, but he never talked about it. I was able to get a copy of the ship's manifesto of the ship that he was on. But being that young, he's listed as student.
Right, right.
So being a student, he may not have had to pay. That I'm not sure of. You'd have to ask a historian. But he did go back to China 3 times up until about 1930. So coming back when he's older, he might have had to pay. So that this is all kind of a mystery to me. The Chinese then were allowed to go back for only a 2-year period. And so he went back 3 times, and there may have even been a limit. And during one of those trips, he actually got married in China. He had a wife and 2 children in China, as well as a wife and 2 children in Canada. And that was common for that time period, because if Chinese men had a family, they weren't allowed to bring them to Canada until after, I think it was 1947.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Have you been to China ever?
Yes, we were invited to go to Guangdong by the Guangdong provincial authorities back in 2009. And they actually took us to my dad's village. So some of those historic villages are being kept for their historic purposes, right? So we went to actually where he was born.
And what did it feel like to go to his village?
What really shocked me is how I felt an attachment to the land, even though my dad was, worried about going back to China, because when he left China, it was a nationalist country, and
right.
he was worried now once China became communist. But when we went there, we just felt a really strong attachment to the land. So somehow that came through, which was quite shocking. It was thrilling to go see his village. We were introduced to a couple of ladies that said they were my nieces, but we didn't get a chance to sit with them long enough to actually verify whether that was true or not, or whether, they had presented them to me just to please me. I don't know.
Also, the documents after the Cultural Revolution are difficult to trace.
Yes.
But it sounds like it was really important for you to go to your dad's village.
It was thrilling. And we actually got to go to Chican, to the Quan family library,
Wow.
where they have the records of every Chinese male and the male descendants from 3,000 years ago. And they flipped through the books, and they gave me copies of them. And they found my dad. They showed me, here's your dad. Yep. And I looked at it. Yes, that's my dad's name in Chinese. And then it ends because he left.
Right, right.
And then they said they were going to put Winston's name in there. So I'm hoping they did put Winston's name in as the next descendant in that line.
That's so remarkable.
Isn't it amazing to go to some place where you have records that go back to the very first Chinese that came to the Guangdong province? So virtually every Quan in Canada is related.
That's amazing. I mean, it's so meaningful. How did your parents meet? I'm curious. How did they meet and get married?
Well, it relates back to that law, I think. My mother's sister, she actually worked for a Chinese restaurateur in Saskatchewan. When my mom was visiting, she introduced my mom to my dad, who ran a restaurant in another small village not too far from there. And apparently she worked for my dad for a while, and then they got married. They got married in a town called Livelong, Saskatchewan.
Live long, Saskatchewan?
Yes, and her sister married a Chinese man, and they had a restaurant in a town called Paradise Hill, Saskatchewan.
Somebody was poetic naming all these towns.
Yes, exactly.
Saskatchewan. So going back to Café Daughter, I wanted to ask, what was the most impactful part of the film for you?
I think what really made me cry was the scene in the movie where Yvette gets to stand up and speak to the graduating class, her high school graduation. And she says, my name is Yvette Wong. My mother was Catherine Wong. My dad was Charlie Wong. And to me, that was the most impactful because for some reason, my parents have always been the motivation for me to succeed. And I always carry them very close to my heart. So when she got up and said that and honored them, it was just wonderful. I get emotional now just talking about it.
Oh, I feel emotional just hearing the story from you. And was that a key parallel in your own life?
Yes. Strangely enough, when I was called to the Senate and I started thinking about who I was and my history of my family, that's when I discovered all the laws that were racist towards Chinese, the early Chinese. Of course, I knew about some of the laws, the Indian Act and the racism against about Indians in Canada. And so in quite a few of my speeches, I would end with, saying, especially some of my outside speeches that was in honor of my parents, or if I received an award, it was a memory of my mother, Eva McNabb from the Gordon First Nation, and my dad, Quan Lin Yok from Sai Sing Lei, Guangdong, China.
You accomplished a lot when you were in the Senate. Do you feel like there's more work that you felt like you could have done?
No, I was very happy that I was able to accomplish what I did because it's actually very difficult because to do anything in Parliament takes usually decades, and I had been working on some of those issues when I first arrived in the Senate in 2005. And when I introduced a bill to do what I actually was able to accomplish another way, that bill was defeated, but the legislation that came from the government allowed me to do what I was hoping to do anyway, just in a different way. So it was like plan B.
And it sounds like what you said before, how you were really stubborn, helped to kind of bring about this change in the Senate.
I'm very determined. I persevere. And I remember talking many years ago to a colleague about someone. I was saying, that person is just like a bulldog. They never let go. And they were giving me this look. And I thought, oh, maybe I'm a bulldog too.
And what would you say to young women today that might be listening or might be interested in going into politics or going into science and are not encouraged to do so?
Yeah, you may face barriers that, today I don't think they'll be as bad. The barriers come at some point when you're a minority, but to always try and remember that you are smart, you are talented, you have a lot of skills, to surround yourself. If your parents are still alive, let them, tell you how good you are. And especially if you have friends, to have friends who support you. And what really helped me was I joined the women's group on campus, the feminist group. And that's when I realized that what was happening to me wasn't just me, it was a societal, cultural phenomenon. And that, that helped me understand that that was just part of, what was going on. And then having their support really made it much easier for me to survive what I was going through. So finding those ways to get support and just don't give up.
And it sounds like, in a way, it's about finding your community of supporters.
Exactly. Finding the community, because with my background, of course, I'm in a unique position for most of my life. I've met very few people who are Chinese, First Nation mixes. So it's hard to find that community, but find other communities. So, like, for instance, me and another person created a women in science group in a feminist group that I joined. So then we would get together with other women scientists who were also feeling isolated and needed a social group to kind of, have that other part of their life to enrich the social parts of their life as well. Because when you're the only female in your group, you don't necessarily like golfing, or maybe you don't like hockey. So you're maybe not hanging out with your male colleagues. So if you have a female group and you like ballet, or, you like plays or whatever, then you have another outlet to support you in the social part of your life.
Which sounds really important. What would you say is the result of your work that you're the most proud of?
I'm most proud of my work in the Senate, the changes that I made to the criminal code that actually, for the first time, specifically mention women and specifically say, particularly Indigenous women, or maybe it's Aboriginal women. I can't remember which word they used. They used Aboriginal and Indigenous back and forth because the criminal code typically never mentions gender, never mentions race, because it's supposed to be gender and race neutral. But we know that's not true. We know that's not true. So that was an historic change. In my work as a scientist, I'm probably most proud of not the science itself, but by setting an example for the other women students. I helped them a lot when they faced sexism and gave them an example that, you don't have to necessarily always try and be one of the guys. There's nothing wrong with you. You can be yourself. You can be yourself as a scientist. You don't have to wear pants. You don't have to leave your earrings at home. You can wear lipstick. You can look nice. You can wear makeup and still be a good scientist. You can be who you are as a woman in whatever way you like to express that.
I think that's really good advice. And I think that's so common for women in leadership positions where it's not only that they need to hide their femininity, but it's like they need to hide their childcare responsibilities if they have children, if they need to leave a little earlier to pick up their kids and then work a little later afterwards. All of that, I think it's so important as a
Yeah.
leader to show that that is part of life.
Yes, that's it exactly. And for my generation, you could not bring your kid to work, but now it's seen as normal. So gradually those doors are opening. If you look at women scientists in my age, most of us either had one or two kids or no children, right? There wasn't accommodation made for the realities of being a mother. But now it's changed. In fact, actually, during the time that I was a scientist, the some of my younger male colleagues took advantage of that, right? They get to go home because they have childcare responsibilities, but I never got to do that. But I thought that's a good thing because, you know, we are not just robots. We are not just, employees, scientists, professors, whatever. We also have lives where we're mothers and fathers, and we have other responsibilities in addition to our work. It's a
Absolutely.
more balanced approach.
Absolutely. So I know you're retired now from the Senate, but do you have other projects that you're working on now in retirement?
I try to limit them. I've been really good at saying no. I still do accept some speeches where I talk about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and the changes I made to the criminal code. Mostly, I do that as lectures at a university. So I do those kind of talks. I do some other kind of work more related to my Senate work. But as I said, I'm in my 70s and I really just want to let the younger people take over, let fresh minds come in, and let go of as much as I can. and enjoy myself, right?
That's the most important thing to do of all. Enjoy yourself in retirement.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Lillian, for coming on our show.
Oh, thank you. Very nice to talk to you, Melissa, and all the best in your endeavors in the museum. I hope to get out there. I was planning to get there in March, I think it was, but I had to cancel the trip.
Oh, no. Well, we really hope you can come someday. Thank you so much. We hope to further our own understanding of Chinese and Indigenous relations and continue to amplify these stories at the Chinese-Canadian Museum. This podcast was recorded on the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. We invite you all to reflect on the territories that you're on and the host nations. To learn more about the Chinese-Canadian Museum and book tickets, visit us at ChineseCanadianMuseum.ca and follow us on Instagram at CCMuseumBC for updates. The School Room is presented by the Chinese-Canadian Museum, hosted by Dr. Melissa Carmen Lee, and produced by Rosalie Gonawan. Production is supported by Noah Taylor and the Walrus Lab. The theme music and original audio was created by Joshua Young, and graphic design is by Studio Pian Pian He and Max Harvey. Stay tuned for next month's episode of The School Room, available wherever you get your podcasts.